Right guys, so we're here on the hack squat. One of the things that often comes up when we talk about hack squats and the difference between this and a leg press or a V squat or different types of pendulum squat or even different types of hack squat, what you'll notice here is that we've basically got a straight line between the foot plate and the position at which you can put your shoulders. So that means that when Paddy gets into the machine, that he's starting in a fully, basically a similar position to that you'd be in when you're standing up. So normally in a squat, when we're standing up straight, there's a straight line basically from the bar to our shoulder, to our hip, to our knee, to our ankle. However, when we do some leg press variations, what ends up happening is that our hips are already flexed from the starting position. So what we can see here is we've got this nice straight line all the way up through, whereas if this was actually a leg press, it'd be similar to Paddy's body being at this angle. So why is that actually important? The reason that's important to realize is because if you're doing a leg press or some sort of other kind of squat variation where you're already starting with the hips in a flexed position, it means that you've got less hip flexion to then be able to work through. So the implication of that is that the hip joint or hip mobility is likely to be the limiting factor before you reach your end range at the knee, for example. So in this case, what you're going to see is that Paddy's probably going to be able to go a lot deeper here than he would be able to on a standard kind of 45-degree leg press, because he's not going to be limited by that hip range of motion. So what I want you guys to pay attention to now is basically the angles at the different joints as Paddy comes down to the bottom. So if you'll do a rep for me there, Paddy, and maybe just pause in the bottom position if you don't mind. So what you'll notice here is that Paddy's hips are basically in maybe, you could say maybe 110, 120 degrees, but that knee is like maxed out in terms of its range of motion. So you can come up to the top again. And the reason that's important to get is because we're not going to get that same experience on something like a 45-degree leg press. So on an exercise like this, we're really able to get into that deep knee flexion. And for many people, they do report that being a much better stimulus for their own quadriceps. Obviously, there's going to be differences between individuals in terms of how this exercise actually feels, whether it be due to, differences in ankle mobility or different body segment proportions. But in this case, when I'm looking at this exercise, I'm thinking that for someone like Paddy, this is a really nice variation for training the quads, okay? So in general, when we're going to be trying to train the quads in an exercise like this, we're going to take a nice comfortable stance that's similar enough to your standard squat stance. So in general, I'm not too worried about, feet being super close or super wide or high up or low down. I'm kind of going to start by telling people, right, let's see how it feels in the middle. Let's see what that range looks like that you can work through, and then we can play around with it from there. One of the key variables that comes up, especially if you're working with someone like Paddy who's quite tall, or even if someone could be shorter but they could have quite a long torso, that segment of their body could be larger, is that you might actually run out of padding. So in this case, you've got a pad that runs from the head down towards the lower back. But if you guys can see in under there, you'll see that pad actually ends at around Paddy's kind of lower back region. So what that means then is that we've kind of got a bit less support around the lower back region. So that might be something to just be mindful of, because you could have someone who's taller than Paddy who's just running off of that. So that might be uncomfortable, and it might be something that I say, if my client is finding it uncomfortable, that I add in maybe a towel or something like that for them, or maybe just to get the cueing, you put the towel in but also put your hand in to kind of get a feel for actually maintaining that position. So that's one of the key things that you want to work on here during this exercise is when you're coming to the bottom, I want Paddy's lower back staying there the whole time. So as you come down, Paddy, he's constantly thinking about pushing that lower back in against the actual padding. So if that is starting to come off as you're working with your client, whether it be this or another variation, that kind of proprioceptive feedback can be super helpful. So if I come to this side, it'll probably be clearer, but if I'm coaching one of my clients and they're just not getting it, the body awareness maybe isn't there or whatever, if I say, okay, Paddy, so what I want you to do as you come to the bottom, I want you to press your back in against my hand throughout. So let's take it nice and slow. Let's work together on it. And he's pushing into my hand. So push into the hand as you push up now. There you go. Okay, and you can rack the weight. So by doing that, guys, by just having that additional bit of feedback for your client, it makes sure that they're actually applying the forces in the way that you'd want to. Because what that means then is that as they're shoving their feet into the pad and they're shoving their hips back, that we're getting really efficient force transfer from the foot to the hip, and that really starts to challenge the quads. Another cue that you can add in for your clients here, if they're maybe not really getting it or they're not really feeling it on the quads, or you think it could potentially be better, is as they do that, as they drive the hips back, also imagine that you're trying to drive the feet forward. So although, you know, your standard kind of approach to this is going to be just to push into the pad, what's also working against you here, or with you, depending on how you look at it, is the force of friction, okay? So if this had zero coefficient of friction, it was just totally slippy, it was like ice, Paddy's leg's gonna fly right off. So I want him to think about that. So as he's doing the exercise, I want him to actually try and shove his feet forward. So that's really going to add that extra bit of intent to actually using the quads then. Because most of these types of machines, or these foot plates, they will have some sort of like kind of sandpaper type feel to them. They'll be rough, so you don't have to worry about the foot actually sliding off. But that's a way of modifying the forces that you're dealing with. So you don't have to add extra load here to modify the forces. You can actually adjust the forces that you're dealing with through friction. Because as Paddy's foot goes forward, we've got a force that's coming back against him in the form of friction, and that is challenging the knee extensors or the quads. So we can really make that exercise a lot more challenging on the quads throughout the range of motion without even adjusting the weight. So guys, on a hack squat like this, you do have the option to adjust your foot position forward and back. So for the most part, when I'm starting with a client, you know, I'm just thinking, right, let's get the feet in a comfortable position that allows the person to work through a reasonable range of motion that seems appropriate for them. And I'm not going to be too worried about like exactly where the feet might be once it's comfortable. But there are some changes in terms of the mechanics of the exercise when you do move the feet around. So if Paddy starts with his feet really close back under him, what I have to think about, right, what are the demands going to be here? And I know that from the start that if his feet are back under him, I know that there's going to be more forward knee travel, which could potentially, you know, be more quad dominant or knee dominant and something that's desirable. But what I also have to account for in that context is that it's also going to demand more from the ankle. So we're going to need more ankle mobility, more ankle dorsiflexion range of motion to be able to work through the range of motion like that. So Paddy, as you come down to the bottom, so that's fine for him, but I can see there that more of the weight's being shifted to the forefoot, and he's starting to evert that foot a little bit, so it's starting to fall in. So that tells me that the ankle joint is likely to be the limiting factor, because very clearly, you know, that wasn't the end of his hip range of motion, and it wasn't the end of his knee range of motion, you know. So even a quick screen, like Paddy, you lift your right leg up as high as you can. He has loads left at both the hip and the knee, you know. So you know in this case, the ankle's the limiting factor. Do you want that? You might, but in most cases you probably don't, okay? So in that case, if I wanted someone to work with their feet back under them and, you know, really make sure that the knee was doing most of the moving there, what I might do is get someone to elevate their heels or use some sort of squat shoe, and that could actually kind of remedy the situation here. Because if we just simulated it with Paddy on his tippy toes, now come down for me, Paddy, he can go down much lower. Because basically what we've done is we've replicated him having more ankle dorsiflexion range of motion by elevating the heel. Now, opposite situation, we go right up to the top. Now we've got a situation where Paddy is starting in a little bit of hip flexion. So he's starting in, even if it's only 10-15 degrees, it's a little bit of hip flexion, and with the feet further in front, it's likely here that we're going to basically see the limiting factor in terms of actual range of motion being the hip joint, because we're going to be working through more overall hip flexion. Now with that said, you can still like really try to place a lot of emphasis on the quads here, and I quite like this as a variation for people, because as the feet go further forward, you actually have more of a tendency to apply that friction force, because when your feet are slipped forward right to the front, it's almost like your feet are going to slip off, so you basically have that tendency to shove the feet forward, and that can really make for an effective quad stimulus. Because if Paddy's able to keep his hips down here and the feet up nice and high, and he's thinking about feet forward, you're really going to start to feel the quads lighting up during that. So if you want to do a rep like that, Paddy, and up again. Now, the good thing about that is that although we're still trying to find ways of trying to hit the quads here by using that friction and using our cueing, etc., we're not taking the knee joint into as much of an extreme of knee flexion as we are when Paddy's doing his kind of standard variation and going really deep. So that's one of the things to, I guess, understand here, is that you can kind of adjust the stimulus that someone feels subjectively, or that we might, you know, count objectively, you could say, through different parameters. So in this case, when Paddy has the feet forward, we've got less knee flexion, but we're still trying to find ways to really train the quads. But that might actually be desirable in some cases if you have a client who, you know, they can get down nice and low into deep knee flexion, but you might find that when they do that, maybe their knees are in more pain for the rest of the workout or for the next session, you know. So if someone comes to you and they find that deep knee flexion is particularly provocative, you know, if they're recovering from an injury or they're post-surgery or something like that, and you're really trying to work the quads, you might actually take them onto an exercise like this, put the feet forward and use friction to your benefit and the cueing to your benefit to reduce the amount of range of motion that they're working through at the knee, while still, you know, really lighten up the quads at an exercise like this. So there's some of the variables that you have at play.